this lesson, we'll cover work sharing. So you may say, well, what is work sharing? Let's look at this model for example. We have a lot of different things going on. There's mechanical systems, HVAC, electrical, plumbing. You also have structural elements, your floors, beams, columns, and obviously the architectural details, the walls, the doors, the windows, the furniture. So is it all created by one individual or do multiple individuals contribute to the project? I guess that's a question depending upon the firm or your company you work at. So let's say multiple people are adding or contributing to this overall project. How do they go about entering that information in? Do you pass around the Revit file person to person to person? Or does each person have a copy of the file that then at the end you just kind of mesh it all together? Now that's one method. Another method is work sharing. And what's meant by that is there's a central file created. And then all of the users, contributors, whoever is working on that individual piece, create their pieces on their local copy of the central file. And as they add, that information is synchronized to the main copy or central file. That central file then synchronizes everything down to everyone else. So the users are always up to date with what all the other users are adding to this central file. When you create the central file, well, you can do it first when you create the template, or you can create it anytime after the design has been started. But again, you need to create the central file first. So how do we go about creating the central file? Now, it's all done on the Collaborate tab within Revit. So click Collaborate, and once the tab appears, you have a variety of controls that will actually control this central file and your local copy of the central file once it's created. So the first thing we need to do in creating the central file is define what's called a work set. Go ahead and click Work Sets on the left. By default, it's going to tell you to make the first work set based upon the shared levels and grids within your model. Go ahead and click OK. Now, what Revit will do is it'll read all the levels, all the grids within this model, and start to actually build that work set. From there, it's going to ask you to define additional work sets. You may say, well, what's a work set and how do I define that? Well, think of it this way. What are the users that need to contribute to the project? Is there a person building the HVAC system? Is there another person building the electrical system? Another person still doing the plumbing? What about the architect or architects working on the walls, doors, and windows? What are the structural engineers calculating loads for floors and beams and columns? So these could all be individuals that are actually contributing to the actual project. So they would have a work set defined to them specifically for the area of what they're working on. Now, if you have less people in your firm, maybe you make a work set just for MEP, or just for structure, or just for architectural elements. Or if you have a lot of individuals and you want to make this more finite, maybe you have a more defined work set, such as one for, again, piping, plumbing, maybe doors, maybe a work set for windows, maybe a work set for fire alarms, or even a work set for lighting and power. So again, it depends upon the firm that you work at or your company as to what you create within your work set. So when the work set window appears, here's the work sets that were created by default, the shared levels of work set 1. And we need to create additional work sets. And for this example, we'll just name a few based on what we just discussed. So to create a new work set, click New in the upper right. And I'm going to call work set in this example HVAC. Click OK. I'll create another work set and I'll call it plumbing in this example. Again, click OK. And maybe I'll create another work set and call it electrical in this example. And again, these can be whatever you choose. They could be as descriptive as this or less descriptive. You can make a work set just for MEP. And of course, I can have a work set for architectural details like doors, windows, other components. Again, depending on what you want. Now looking at these columns, the column that reads editable basically just means that an owner or a user can take ownership of that work set. And what this means is this, and this can help you define a work set. If me as a user checks out or takes ownership of the HVAC work set, that means I'm the only one that can modify anything in that HVAC work set, meaning all the HVAC components. Everyone else can see it, but they can't modify it. So depending on that answer to that question, you may want to just create a work set for MEP or maybe HVAC or specifically ducts and other elements of the HVAC system. Again, depending on how many people need to work on it. Owner is the owner, boot is, borrow is if you're borrowing it, and open is open, and invisible is when invisible within the views. And again, I can edit this at any point moving forward. Once you've added these, simply click OK. This will create those work set elements. Now see that in the drop-down in the work set area, here's the actual work sets we created. Revit also placed a work set drop-down on the very bottom of your screen, so you don't have to continually come back to the Collaborate tab to switch work sets. So this sets up the work sets. The next step is to save this as a central file. And to do that, it's just a matter of going to the large R, Save As, Project, and then defining this as a project name. In this case, I'm going to call this Central File. Now, there's already one in this actual example called Central File 1901 for this lesson. Don't rename that because that file is used in subsequent lessons. So for this here, I'm just going to call this Central File and then click Save. Again, save it where your chapter settings are at for this lesson. Also, on my screen, notice that there's a folder created for that other central file, the 1901 backup. So when you create this central file, there will be a central file backup folder created as well. So I click Save. The central file is being published to the directory where you chose this to be set. The work sets are created, and we're almost ready to go. The last step that you want to do is relinquish anything that you had ownership of since you created the work sets. So this would be the Relinquish All Mine icon on the Collaborate tab. This will basically give up ownership if you own anything. I'll just verify I synchronized all of my changes back to the server. So I'll just say Synchronize Now from the Synchronize dropdown. This will push everything back to the workset file itself. And at this point, I've created that central file from within my workset. So as a review, in this lesson, we covered work sharing. We talked about what is work sharing and how does it work. Well, work sharing is the way to create a central file that all users can synchronize changes to that central file while working on their local copy of this project. The central file can be divided into work sets based on function or discipline of what the users do, such as mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, or more specifically, HVAC, electrical, piping, tubing, or architectural elements, doors, windows, and walls. Lastly, we looked at creating the actual central file, and then relinquishing all control of any work set you currently had, and then synchronizing those changes back to the central file. In this lesson, we'll cover setting up the user's local copy of the Revit project that will synchronize to the central file. So in previous lessons, we created a central file, which is basically the master file for a Revit project. All users then would have a local copy of that central file in which they would make their modifications to the things they want to modify, and that would then be synchronized to the central file and then out to all the other users who have a local copy. So once we have the central file created, our next task now is to create the user copies of the central file. This can be done on the server, by an administrator, or the users can do this themselves. To do that, you have to use the Open tool within Revit. You have to point to the central file. So with nothing open, inside of Revit, click Open. Once you click Open, browse to the directory of where you saved the files for this course. You go to Chapter 19. In Chapter 19, you will see a central file called Central File 1901. Now I can select this and use this as this is the one for this exercise. Or if you want to use the central file you created from the previous lesson, Worksharing, you could do that as well too. I'm going to use this one. Now before we click OK or Open, select the actual central file. On the very bottom of the screen, there's a checkbox that says Create New Local View. Revit recognizes that this central file, even though it's called central file, but doesn't have to be, it recognizes it's a central file. So when I click Open now, the Create New Local View will create a new local view of this central file and append the end with the name of the user, such as me, Tim, or however I'm logged in. Technically, I'm logged in this example as the number 1 as a user login, and you'll see that in a minute. So now I can click Open. When you click Open, what Revit is going to do is read the contents of the central file, make a copy of the central file, append the name of the user to the end of the word central file, in this case _1 or underscore your name, and then save it to the default location of where Revit saves your default documents. And you may say, well, where is that? Well, to see that, click the large R in the upper left, then go down to Options. On the Options window, click File Location. In the default path for user files, on my computer, it's read C users 1, that's my login is 1 instead of my name, and then documents. So basically, my documents. So that's where Revit actually created your local copy of this file in that directory. Go ahead and cancel the options window. So basically, this is the local copy, and I can basically start to take next ownership of work sets and work on my project. However, let's just look at the synchronizing tools one more time. Click the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, you have your work sets, which we'll cover in another lesson. But here we have Synchronize. And on the Synchronize dropdown, you have two options. Synchronize now basically means you're just going to synchronize to the central file anything you've modified, and then you'll relinquish control of any work set that you've been working on, meaning other people can then take control of that work set. Synchronize and modify settings gives you additional options. So for example, if I were to click Synchronize and Modify Settings, here it's telling me where the central file is located, so I can see it. I also have the ability to do other things in order to, in this case, relinquish work sets or not after I've synchronized. You can also add in comments, which basically is history of what you've done and what you're synchronizing. And all this will be timestamped with the central file. Just click Cancel. Now again, to show you where this file was saved and how it was named, in my computer, it was saved within the user's username in Documents folder, basically my documents. So if I bring up Windows File Explorer, now we're to click Documents on the left, I can see here's the actual document, central file 1901_1. Yours would be the central file 1901 underscore your username, whatever that username may be. Now, if you don't like the word central file in this, you can rename the file to whatever you want. But usually keep the name of it, that way it's easily tracked on whose actual project or user project this is. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at user setup. We've already created the central file for this Revit project, and the user setup was creating the local copy of the central file that the user would use to synchronize changes back to the central file. We walked through the steps of creating that user file, and we also looked at where Revit saves the file. In this lesson, we'll cover work sharing ownership. So for this lesson, we're going to open up the user copy of the central file that we created in previous exercises. If you don't have that, the file you can open for this exercise is worksharing_username, and that's what I'm going to do for this example. So let's go to the Open button in Revit, browse to Chapter 19, and select the file worksharing_username. Now, technically, it's going to be the name of the central file underscore your username, and feel free to use that file if you want from the previous exercise. However, if you don't have that file or not sure of that file, please use this one. So open up worksharing_username. This again is the local user copy of the file that was created from the central file. So this is the one that I would be working on my local computer and then synchronizing changes back to the actual central file. So let's talk about the work set ownership and how it works. So to view these work sets, let's go to the Collaborate tab, and on the left, click Work Set. Now these are the work sets that were originally created on the central file. Right now, they're all marked as No for editable. And really what that means is no one has ownership of any of these work sets, so anyone can take ownership. Now, you may say, well, do I want to take ownership or don't I want to take ownership? Well, here's a couple things if you want to take ownership and why you may or may not want to take ownership. If you take ownership of one of these work sets, that means you and only you can make modifications to the elements within that work set. Maybe that's a plus because that locks everyone else from making any type of design change or modification to those elements in the work set. However, it could be detrimental too because if you're working in a team and someone else is using a shared work set, you can't necessarily modify it because you have it locked. Now, another reason to actually take ownership is if you're under design review. So if something is designed and you do not want to allow anyone to make a modification, whether purposely or accidentally, you can take ownership of the work set, therefore locking it. So how do you do that? So let's say you wanted to work on the actual plumbing layout, and I want to take ownership of the work set. Basically, all I have to do is change no to yes, and then your name would appear under owner. Now, my login for this session is 1. Yours would probably be your name or however you log into Windows. Then all I have to do is click OK. Now I have ownership of that work set. That work set is mine. I could do the same thing for other work sets as well. But what you want to do is if you're working within the work set, whether you have ownership of it or not, you want to make sure it's the active work set. And I could do that in the drop down here on the very top of my ribbon, or the same thing on the bottom of your screen. Now you may say, well, why do I want to activate it? Didn't I just take ownership of the plumbing work set? Yes, you did. Taking ownership again just locks the work set and anything in it so others can't modify it. But the reason you want to activate a work set is because anything you add to Revit moving from this point forward is associated to the active work set. So if I want to work on plumbing, I make sure I activate the plumbing work set. Then if I change, and let's say I wanted to work on the mechanical system, HVAC, well, make sure you activate the HVAC work set. But again, you don't have to take ownership. You only have to take ownership if you want to lock that work set. But if you just want to actually add something or modify something to the work set, meaning others can do the same thing too, just activate the work set. Now, once you're done with any modifications you've made, you can synchronize. Again, synchronize being here within the ribbon of collaborate. I can synchronize now, which basically pushes all the changes back to the central server and relinquishes any ownership you've taken to a work set. So in this case, since I took the plumbing ownership, it would pass it back and I'd give up the ownership of plumbing. Synchronize and modify settings actually has a few more additional items that you can do. One is you can relinquish the work sets if you want, and 2, add comments, meaning text for history of what I've done within this time frame of synchronizing back to the actual central server. But cancel. So as a review, in this lesson, we opened up the local user file created from the central server. You could use the one you created, or we used the one that came with this lesson. Then we looked at taking ownership of work sets and what it really means. Well, if you take ownership of a work set, that means you and only you have control of the elements within that work set, and no one else can modify them until you relinquish control. We talked about the positives and negatives, meaning the positive, if I'm under design review, I can lock that so no one can modify it. Negative is no one can modify it or add to it. The other thing we looked at was activating or choosing an active work set. You want to do this because anything you add from that point forward is added to whatever work set is active, whether you have ownership or not. And lastly, we looked at synchronizing. Synchronizing any changes back to the central server and relinquishing ownership if you've taken ownership for any work set. In this lesson, we'll cover Worksharing Detach. So you may say, well, what is Worksharing Detach? What does that have to do with our central file or our user file? Well, let me paint a scenario for you. Let's say you're an architect firm or design firm and you're working on this Revit project and you need to actually share the Revit model with a consultant. Well, what you don't want to do is make a copy of the central file, and you definitely don't want to make a copy of your user file to send to the actual consultant, simply because they still have all of these shared synchronizing capabilities in it back to the central server. What you really want to do is make a copy of either your file or the central file, and then detach all of the synchronization settings or work set settings that would tie it back to your central file. Now you could do this with either your copy, meaning your local copy, or the central file copy. Depending upon what you want to send to the consultant, make sure everybody synchronizes first. In this example, we'll use the actual file we have as a user. Now, another case for this is if you received a file from an architect or design firm, and you go to open it and you get a message about it being tied to a central file. You can actually manually break that if it's causing confusion or issues opening the file. And you'd follow the same steps we'll use here. To detach a file from a central server or central file, let's follow these steps. So what you do is you would go to the Open menu within Revit and browse to the file that you want to detach. Now again, it could be the central server file, or it could be your local copy of the file you sync to the server. Or it could be that file the architect sent you that it's still tied to their central server. This example will choose Worksharing username. Now on the very bottom, you have an option in Worksharing called Detach from Central. So even if you did choose the central file, you still could select the same thing. That basically relinquishes and removes any of the synchronization settings from the central file to the users and vice versa. Audit would basically tabulate an audit trail for what you do. Now, I'm not going to select that because that'll take a little time for it to actually audit this actual file. So when you select this, you're going to see a message box next stating what you're actually about to do is detach it. So make sure you click Worksharing or the file name, check mark Detach from Central, then click Open. Here now it's telling you you're about to basically break all of these links and make this model independent from the central file and all the other users. So what do you want to do? Obviously you want to detach, but do you want to keep the work sets in the work set drop down, or do we want to disregard the work sets? That's a question up to you depending upon how this is actually going to be used. In this example here, I'm going to choose the first one, detach and preserve work sets. So let's go ahead and select Detach and Preserve Work Sets. So what Revit does now is basically opens that file, removes any work sharing capabilities to the central server, but retains the work sets. To see that, let's go to the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, click Work Sets. You can see all the work sets are here, but notice you have ownership to all of the work sets. Again, I'm logged in as user 1, that's my username. Your owner name would be you, or however you log into Windows. To see that I'm not connected to a central server, click Cancel, and notice that the Synchronize button is grayed out. Therefore, I cannot synchronize this, and this is a standalone file. The last step is you basically would do a file save as. So I can go to the large R, save as, project, and then save this as a standalone project file name that I could give to my consultant, or if it's one that I got from an architect that was still tied to their central server, just would break the links and now I can open it and work on that project file. In this example though, I'm not going to save it, just click cancel. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at work sharing detach. We talked about why you would want to detach. An example of that would be if you had a file or your Revit project that you wanted to send to a consultant. You don't want to send them that file of the central server file or your local user file that had all the synchronization settings in it. Another method of why you'd want to do this is if you received a file from an architect that had their synchronizations in it to their central file. So in these scenarios, you want to detach the file and remove any of the synchronization settings back to the central file on the server. And to do that, we would use the workgroup Worksharing detach. The method is to open the file and choose the detach button on the very bottom, and then choose if you want to preserve or not preserve actual work sets. In this lesson, we'll cover viewing work sharing history and also how to restore a corrupt file, whether that be the central file or your local user file that synchronizes to the central file. First, let's look at history. So let's open up that local file that we used within work sharing. So go to the Open menu, browse to Chapter 19 for this lesson, and choose Worksharing underscore username. Click Open. This again is just opening up that local file. Now you could open your local file that you created from previous lessons, but you may not have any history if you didn't synchronize. This file has history. So to view the history of what I've done, meaning synchronized, or what others have done, synchronized to the central server, let's click the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, click Show History. This will then ask me, well, what do you want to view the history of? Your file or the central file? Now let's choose the central file 1901. Click Open. This will then show me the history of that central file for everyone that is synchronized and when they've synchronized their copies to the central file. Comments are also noted. Now again, in the modified column, I'm user 1. That's how I'm logged into Windows. These are my synchronizations that I've done, and I've added some comments to my synchronizations. I'm also seeing other synchronizations by other users going back in time. You may say, well, wow, that goes way back. Well, the file that we used to create the central file was actually one of the sample files that comes with Revit. And it, in turn, was part of a central file back in history or back in time. That's why we see this history here. But it's a good example of what you would actually see if you looked at the history of a file within Worksharing. Now again, the modified could be a name, first initial, last name, full name, a number, totally dependent upon how Windows is configured within your workgroup environment. Again, this is to view the history of a file being synchronized within Worksharing. Let's click Close. Now, let's say your file becomes corrupt, whether it's the central file or your local file. How do you restore it? How do we get that back? Well, luckily, inside of Worksharing, and to show this, I'll browse to the Chapter 19 folder. For every file you create for a user and every file you create for the central file, Revit makes a backup folder with backup information. So I can see the central file 1901 has a backup folder named after it. The Worksharing username folder also has a backup folder named after it. And likewise from your previous lessons, when you created a user file in your My Documents directory, you'll have a backup directory there as well. So now that we know the backup is there, how do we restore? Let's go back to Revit and close anything that you have open. The first thing you need to do is to create a new blank project. So just click New, choose the template Mechanical, and click OK. This will again create a blank project. Now, for the restore, let's go to the Collaborate tab. On the Collaborate tab, click Restore Backup. This will then ask you to browse to one of the backup folders. Now, depending on what you want to restore, the central file if it's corrupt, or your local user file if it's corrupt, we'll choose the local user file directory. So double-click the Worksharing username backup, which is located in the Chapter 19 folder for this lesson. Select it or double-click it or put it in the folder name on the very bottom. Click Open to see the contents of what you can restore. Now, what's in this folder are actually the synchronization states from when you synchronize. And I can see in this example here, I have 3. So I can choose which one I want to restore from. So in this case, I'm going to choose the first one, Current 1. And all I have to do is choose Save As. This will then ask me to restore this file to a new name in a directory that I want. And then that will then be able to be opened, pulling the information, including the synchronization settings, back to the central server or central file. Same scenario if you restored the central file. This would save that file back to that directory and location, and now you can use it. I'll click Cancel though in this example, and then close. So as a review, in this lesson, we looked at doing Worksharing history. We also looked at how do you restore a corrupt file from a backup. For Worksharing history, you can look at the History tab from Collaborate and view the history of either the central file or any user's file on their local computer and see the history of all the synchronizations that have done by you, the user, and other users to that central file. If you have a corrupt file, whether that be the central file or your local user file, luckily Revit creates a backup folder backing up information for the central file and the user file upon synchronizations. To restore, simply close all files, create a new blank project, and then use the Restore Backup on the Collaborate tab, pointing to the backup folder for either the central file or the local user file, and then pick which sync period you would like to restore back to.